I'm talking about tallies.
Okay.
I talk about
We have a non-compete agreement.
It's already
Confidentiality
on
agreement.
the.
Oh, this is so good.
Yeah, you just gotta
Thank you.
find it in the participant list.
Okay. All right.
If I want to see the people, I gotta not look at you.
No, you have it on the other side of the table.
Yeah, you can break the mold. My feelings won't be hurt.
Okay. So to get.
Recording in progress.
Ah,
Can you hear now?
can you hear now? Okay, this is so good. All right. Excellente. All right. Shirley, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, I'm gonna put you guys on mute for right now. Okay. All right. We're gonna start in just a moment.
That's as loud as it goes.
Okay. All right. That seems a little echoey, doesn't it? No? Is it just me?
What did you say?
It seems echoey? Yeah, no? No. Oh, you know what? It's coming through my speakers. That's why it sounds echoey. So I'm gonna mute myself. There we go. Oh, that's so much better. Okay. We are cooking with gas now. Cooking with gas. The only thing that I don't see here are my breakout rooms. There we go. There's breakout rooms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
You're not gonna have to.
Assign manually. I don't want participants to choose their room. Is there something else I need to do? Just assign manually, right?
Yeah,
And then here,
and then you can, in the options there,
I can say,
automatically move.
move.
And if you wanna set a timer on it automatically too.
Set countdown timer, yeah.
Well, that's
Auto
to come,
close
yeah.
after 7 minutes.
No, thank you.
You know, there's no cheating for a theology class, right? Like you
Oh.
can't look at my paper and have it be the right answer.
All right.
Fine, sit here and I won't cheat.
Okay, so I'm going to make Amy. All right. So we have more people on Zoom, fewer people in person. This is,
They went to go get tea.
oh, they're here.
Yeah,
But they went to go get tea? Where are they getting tea?
in the kitchenette.
You just can't see them.
Ah, okay. Oh, there you are. Okay. All right. All right.
Don't apologize. We would have waited hours for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Great. I think we are, just get to my text here. And here we go. Here we go. Let's see. So,
Don't, you were planning. No.
okay.
Oh, we'll be there with our.
Okay. So, all right,
Would there be lots
good. Do I have everybody in the room? I think I do. Okay. So this.
No. We get a little bowl. Are you at 2? And we have 4. Do we know the other one? Sam?
Okay. So I think we have everybody here and who's coming. I know that there are a couple of people who were not able to attend tonight. And so I want to make sure again, everybody on Zoom can hear me. Thumbs up. You guys can hear me? Awesome. Excellent. Excellent. We have agreed to, if we need to have some extra time, to go up till 8:30. And so we'll keep to that, although if we're done beforehand, there's no need to stretch things out. I want to make sure that everybody has the text or is near somebody who has the text for tonight's session, both on Zoom and present in the room. And so this is the second session, and we are looking at the issue of divine intervention now tonight, looking at rabbinic sources. And we'll say a little bit about the rabbinic sources. You had a chance to look at them. We will also take some time tonight in that Chavruta style of learning, where we'll have an opportunity to look at the texts a little more closely and then come back together and talk about what those conversations were like. So the Rabbinic period, so let me give you a little framing, okay? So the Rabbinic period introduces additional perspectives regarding divine intervention, right? The Rabbinic period begins following the fall of the Second Temple, right? In the year 70 of the Common Era, at a time when the Jews had lost their foundational place of worship and their sense of whether and how their relationship with God would continue. Unlike the biblical picture of divine intervention that we studied last week, the divine intervention in Egypt, God had allowed for the destruction of the temple as well as a massacre and displacement of the people, right? It is only natural that the rabbis begin to offer additional and diverse ways of envisioning God's role in the world, okay? So essentially, their own experience had a dramatic effect on their theology, in their understanding of how God worked in their lives, how God worked in the world, right? So we're going to see a distinct difference between, in many ways, between the rabbinic view and what we saw last week in the biblical view. Okay, so far so good? All right, awesome. So let's continue. So the first text is from the Babylonian Talmud, from the tractate that's called Shabbat, from page 156 on folio sides A and B. Right? So just to refresh everyone's memory of what the Talmud is, the Talmud is the central corpus of the rabbinic tradition, right? I said, the Talmud says, that's the beginning of any great teaching, right? Well, in the Talmud it says, and it was recorded, the Talmud that we refer to when we say the Talmud says is the Talmud that was written in Babylonian. So take note of this, that it's the Talmud of the diaspora, right? Because there was also a Talmud that was written in the land of Israel. It used to be called the Palestinian Talmud until recent, contemporary times, when that word has taken on a different connotation. Sometimes it's called the Jerusalem Talmud, even though it was not written in Jerusalem, it was written in the Galilee, in the academies in the Galilee, in the north of Israel. And sometimes it's referred to as the Talmud of the land of Israel, which is probably more and more how it is referred to. But what's interesting, always interesting to me, is that the Babylonian Talmud, that is the Talmud of the diaspora, becomes the authoritative Talmud, right? We would imagine that the Talmud of the land of Israel, because of where it was written, would be the dominant text. Phyllis?
Where is Babylonia in today's world?
So Babylonia is to the east of Israel, in the area, Persia, Iran, Iraq, that area. The Tigris and the Euphrates, those two rivers that continue to flow today, that's that area, to the east, right? This way's east, yes, east of Israel. Yeah, yeah. Let me just check. I'm looking, I see that there's a, Turover is, okay, good. Okay. So, okay, good. So it's organized, so it was recorded in Babylonia, but it unfolded over a number of generations, as I said, in both Babylonia and in Israel. So it just in terms of a timeline, it's redacted between the 3rd and the 6th century of the Common Era. So what we see today is pretty much was finalized, codified by the end of the 6th century. Okay. It's organized around the structure that's presented by the Mishnah. So the Mishnah has 6 orders. It's really that first layer of oral tradition written down. And I keep watching this and seeing and making sure. Okay, there's a little red note, but I don't see a new chat. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm still getting used to this multi-access teaching. So I just want to make sure that everybody is taken care of here. Okay, so the Mishnah is that first layer of commentary to the Torah. The Mishnah, for the most part, is concerned with law, with halakha, right? How do you observe Shabbat? How do you observe kashrut? How do you celebrate Passover? How do you conduct your business, right? All of the laws that are pertaining to that, with the exception of the chapter which is called Avot, which is sometimes published separately, Pirkei Avot, which is more aphorisms, more of the way that we live our lives, not the legal tradition. So the Talmud is a commentary, so to speak, upon the Mishnah, right? So it's that next layer of commentary of the oral tradition, right? Okay. And but it also presents, it's not just the commentary on the legal stuff, because it presents many narratives, which we're going to look at tonight, and digressions from its original legal core, because the section from Shabbat that we're going to be looking at has nothing to do with Shabbat, right? And that's not at all unusual, that it will riff from that quotation from the Mishnah, because it'll be ostensibly commenting on a particular passage of the Mishnah, but it will then go off onto tangents along the way. Okay. All right. In this text, right, that we're going to look at in a moment, the rabbis debate the power of astrology as opposed to the power of ongoing divine intervention over the people of Israel. Okay. So what I want us to do is to take about 7 minutes in Chavruta. So people who are here, you can just arrange yourselves into 2s and 3s, but please no more than 3s. And let me just make sure that I have everybody on Zoom assigned to a breakout room. Okay. All right. So I'm going to put you in Zoom. You're going to go into breakout rooms, and yes.
I just want to go back a little bit to the different Talmuds.
Sure.
Are they subject matter and organization? Are they totally different?
So they begin the same. That is, they begin as commentary on the Mishnah, but they're written very differently. The Talmud of the land of Israel is much briefer. It's a shorter work. The Babylonian Talmud tends to be much more extensive, and it incorporates more narrative, more of, when they were asking a question about Jewish law, they would bring up, well, when I was visiting with this particular rabbi, I saw him do this at his dinner table. And somebody else would say, well, no, that's not the way you're supposed to do it. This, when I was at this rabbi's table, this. And so the Babylonian Talmud seems to be contain much more material than of narrative than the Talmud of the land of Israel. But they're ostensibly dealing with the same issues, just more tangents in the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, Alan?
There's only one version of the Mishnah, though.
So yes, so there. Well,
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
So yes and no. No. It's a good question because with the Mishnah, yes, there is an accepted text of the Mishnah. There's also I think the phrase is text critical, where there were different versions of the same text. So versions not different in content, but sometimes in wording. And so you would have variants. And so there's a scholarly version of the Mishnah that gives you all of these textual variants. So that would be the difference. You could see that differently then. But the short answer is yes, there's only one version. We don't have a version that was written in Babylonia and a version that was written in the land of Israel. And so that is a simpler way of understanding it. And it is attributed to, the editorship of it is attributed to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. And he finishes redacting it in the 3rd century. It probably wasn't just him, but because he was the authority of the day, when you say that he's the editor, it gives the text that added layer of authority, right? Okay, good. So let's take the next 7 minutes, and I'm going to put the Zoom folks into your rooms. And what I'd like you to do is to read through the text first together. Even if you've read it on your own, read through it together. And then what I'd like you to do, let me give you a few questions to consider let me just close this for a second. As you're looking at the text, so think about these 3 things. Do you believe the most important parts of your life are determined by your DNA and the luck of where you were born? 2, what do you think about natural versus supernatural ways of viewing world events and life experience? And 3, how do you understand the story of Rabbi Akiva's daughter? To what degree does it give agency to human beings? Okay, so do you believe the most important parts of your life are determined by your DNA and the luck of where you were born? What do you think about natural versus supernatural ways of viewing world events and life experience? And how do you understand the story of Rabbi Akiva's daughter? To what degree does it give agency to human beings? Okay, so take the next few moments and here's Ruth. Let me put her in one of the breakout rooms. So go ahead and, okay, so Ruthie, okay, we're going into our breakout rooms, Ruthie, for the first text.
I'm John.
I'm Robin.
So you want us to do the first paragraph?
And from what? And from that which transpired to Rabbi Akiva as well, it can be derived. There is no constellation for church people. As Rabbi Akiva had a daughter, and children astrologers told him that on the same day that she enters the wedding canopy, a snake will bite her and she will die. She was very worried about it. On that day, her wedding day, she took ornamental pin from her hair and stuck it into a hole in the wall for safekeeping. And it happened that it extended directly into the eye of the snake in the morning. When she took the pin, the snake was pulled and came out with it.
Her father, Rabbi Akiva, said to her, "What did you do to merit being saved from the snake?" She told him in the evening a poor person came and knocked on the door, and everyone was preoccupied with the feast, and nobody heard him. I stood and took the portion that you had given me and gave it to him. Rabbi Akiva said to her, "You performed a mitzvah, and that is saved in its merit." Rabbi Akiva went out and taught based on this incident that even though it is written, and charity will save from death, it does not mean that it will save a person only from an unusual death, but even from death itself. Number of questions.
So what's the predominant thing? DNA and birthplace?
Luck of birth.
Environment. And I'm not sure where that question is. Yeah.
So I put the questions also up on the screen just in case you wanted to.
And then actually,
So you think it's, you believe DNA and luck of the birth? If that happens, it's also the environment, the situation, what's going on. It's a lot of things, not just yeah. What did you say? Natural versus supernatural ways. Supernatural. It was
walk out. There's a logic is it's not totally, it's not a totally, random thing. There's something that draws. And that I guess was. There's other.
Was this really an attraction?
She got lucky. She was a good person and did good things, but she was lucky. It saved your life.
This concept of the constellations. And then, according to the Torah, there is no constellation. People are not that. Very much.
What do you do here? So yeah, she said. Answer. She would have we can only assume that this is.
I messed up, Rabbi. I meant to move the box that said I was leaving the room, and I left the room. I have to
Okay,
apologize to my
that's
colleagues.
okay.
I feel terrible. There's only like 30 seconds left. It
Oh,
was a
yeah.
bad slip of the hand. It was a bad slip. I just
And
couldn't need to get rid of it.
Yeah, and I can't put you back in.
Oh. Okay, don't worry about it. You don't have to master this.
Okay,
I will just say, because I was not able to say it in my group, that I was very much influenced, not by Voltaire and Candide and the idea of
yeah,
the best.
yeah.
That is pretty much it. Luann and Sarah, I'm so sorry. It was a sleight of hand. I meant to move the box and I hit leave meeting, and I'm so sorry. I was just telling the rabbi I can't. I shared my thoughts with him because that was the audience. Yeah. Sorry about that.
So thank you, everybody. And so what I wanted to do, actually, let me just make sure that. Okay, good. So a couple of things that I wanted to say before we open it up for more larger group discussion in this is that people are often very surprised that there's any kind of conversation in Jewish texts about the signs of the zodiac, about astrology. People are very surprised, and even more surprised when you travel to Israel and you visit a place called Beit Alpha, and there is a mosaic, a tile mosaic in the floor of what was the synagogue in this ancient city that has the wheel, the zodiac wheel on it with all of the different signs and all the signs that we know, Aries and Libra and Taurus and all of that is in the floor, in the tile of this synagogue, ancient synagogue. It's surprising to see it in the Talmud. It's even more surprising to see it on the floor of a sanctuary space, because of course we all know, having read the 10 Commandments, if nothing else in the Torah, that you're not supposed to make any images. You're not supposed to worship anything other than God. You're not supposed to acknowledge any other. And so it's very, very interesting. So that's one thing. And the Hebrew word for the signs or for the zodiac is mazal. And we know that from mazel tov, right? What does mazel tov mean? Good luck, right? So if you think about it, we're saying good luck as if luck is a factor, right? And we don't really give it any thought other than we think it's mazel tov. It's like congratulations, right? It's like translating mitzvah as a good deed. Mitzvah is not a good deed. Mitzvah is a commandment, right? But we use it interchangeably, and so as we're in conversation with one another, we can say it's a mitzvah to go visit your grandmother. Everybody understands that you're saying it's not a command to go visit your grandmother. It's a good thing to go visit your grandmother. But Mazel Tov, it always strikes me as interesting. We don't associate it with what it's actually referring to here in this text and in others that are like it. So although the biblical drama evinces a clear divine intervention in the world on behalf of the Jewish people, the rabbis debate here whether astrology, considered somewhat scientific in their time, right? So it's not like today where we look at it as this kind of, I don't want to disparage astrology, but many people look at it as kind of, it's a little hocus pocus kind of stuff. It's not scientific in the way that we would normally understand it. But back in the day, this was science. This was a part of what people thought they understood about the world, and seeing the constellations and being able to see images in the sky, that this wasn't accidental and it wasn't a trick of the eye, that this was a part of the created world. And if it's part of the created world, it means something. And if we can understand it, we can understand the created world. So that's what they're looking, right? So they debate whether astrology, considered scientific in the time here in this text, plays a role in determining the fate of the Jewish people as well. So it does, and the idea that astrology could be what determines Jewish fate is a long way from the obvious interventionist ideology expressed in Exodus 6, right? In this, in the story of the Exodus from Egypt and God's intervention with the plagues. And at the same time, it is possible that this discussion is about the fate of individual Jews, right? Rather than that of the Jewish people as a collective, okay? Note that the rabbis are not sure. They are not united, right? In this text, they are not united in their perspectives on the role of astrology. Moreover, even those rabbis who reject astrology as determinant put the power for divine providence into human hands. Rabbi Akiva's daughter is thought to have been saved from astrological determinism, not simply because God intervened, but also because she performed a mitzvah, right? A mitzvah is an action encouraged by God, a commandment, but this anecdote seems to imply that a person's fate is somewhat in their own hands, right? What she did had an impact. If they act in ways that God approves, they will be saved, would be another way of saying this, right? So also, I want you to take note of the very particularistic outlook of the rabbis. They are willing to agree that most of the world is ruled by a kind of astrological determinism, but they only debate how the fate of the Jewish people is determined, right? So it's a very particular view here. All right. What do you think? Yeah, Jay.
When you say that this is to the individual, not to the group, it just, when I read this thing in terms of, thus says the Lord, learn not the way of the nations, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the nations are dismayed at them. The nations will be dismayed by them, but not the Jewish people. It just, I was looking at this in terms of what is the nations, in terms of an Orthodox community that doesn't really interact.
Right, it's everybody, the nations are everybody else, right? In the biblical view, there are 70 nations in the world, right? That's in the time that where Jeremiah is teaching, where this is all coming from, there are 70 nations in the world, and Israel is one of them. And so all the other nations of the world are ruled by these constellations, but not Israel. But not Israel, right? That's how they're reading this text, right? That it holds power, it holds sway, right? That this, we are, I mean, I guess one way would be of saying it would be, we are immune to the power of the astrological signs, to these astrological signs. Yeah, Alan and then Alon. And then I'm looking up here. You're going to have to either raise your hand electronically on Zoom or like, give me a good wave, because I want to make sure that I'm including everyone who wants to speak in this conversation. Alan, then Ilan, and then we'll keep it open.
I'm just picking up a little bit differently that, is it wrong to think he's not saying that the astrology does affect these other people from the outside, as an outside source, but that we are not letting it affect those people, are letting these things that they view as meaningful affect them, whereas we, the Jewish people, have made the conscious decision we won't.
Ah, I see. So what Alan is saying, and I don't know if it's coming through clearly because he's a little bit further away from the microphone. So I will be the translator. So what Alan was saying was that, because we only have the one microphone and it's right, I don't know if you can see, it's right in front of me. I'm appearing on two screens, right? So you see me in my tile, and then you also see me in miniature in the other tile. Little teeny tiny me, little teeny tiny me. So what Alan was saying is that it's a question of personal volition, right? The other nations of the world allow themselves to be under the control of these astrological signs. Israel does not. Or Israel, perhaps I'll add on to this, Israel has the power through the performance of mitzvot to deflect that power. So yes, we can be impacted. So if she had not given tzedakah, if she had not helped out that person, then the snake would have gotten her for sure, right? So we have kind of the antidote to it. We have the ability to write the script of our own lives because we have Torah, and therefore we have the mitzvot, and therefore we can avoid what other nations cannot, who do not follow commandments. Alana.
I think you just answered my question, because I was going to ask, does Israel not follow it because of their belief in one God versus other nations which may have different beliefs in multiple gods or multiple symbols? But I think you just answered.
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting because it recognizes that there is power there, right? They're not denying the power of astrology. They're not denying what at the time was the science of astrology, because it is a part of the created world, right? What they're saying is you don't have to be ruled by it. Through the performance of mitzvot, it's, in a sense, it acts prophylactically, right? It protects you from anything bad happening, seems to be what Rabbi Akiva is understanding from this. And he says it's not just this unusual kind of danger, or unusual death, but any kind of death. So it's really pushing it here. Right? Yeah, Sarah. Sarah, you have to unmute.
The fact that Rabbi Akiva says there is no consolation for the Jewish people, and yet this thing that his daughter does with the pin, it's as if it's just in case, a superstition, just in case, because in fact, even though Rabbi Akiva may not teach his daughter in believing the constellations having power, and interestingly enough, his story is about a snake, which is one of the constellations. There is that hesitancy in his mind, his daughter's mind, that it is possible that indeed, if you don't pay attention to those constellations, there just might be a bad result. So, as a superstition, we'll simply do a good deed and wipe out any chance that anything bad could happen. So it sounds like in those days, there was still, even though Rabbi Akiva says he did not believe that the constellations for the Jewish people, he really did. Am I reading this right?
So
you see what I'm saying?
I think you're on the right. I think he's really trying to walk a very fine line here, right? That he's really trying to acknowledge this science, right? And but I think also the part of the lesson of this story is the power of following the commandments, right? That really the meta message here is follow the commandments, right? And right, remember there's the phrase that v'chai b'hem, right? And that you should live by them or live with them, live through them, right? They give life. And in this case, quite literally, because it seems that even though she was not aware there was a snake in that crevice, when she was hiding the pin, it happened to pierce the serpent, the snake, and prevent it from harming her. It wasn't that she knew that it was there and she tried to kill it, right? It was that what Rabbi Akiva, his logic is, or his first thought is, what did you do to be able to avoid this snake biting you, right? Because it wasn't just by accident that the pin went through the snake and killed the snake. And so he ascribes it in hearing her tell the story of feeding this person, doing this good act, that's what made the difference, right? But he's really trying to walk on, a very fine line, right? This balance, because there is, at least in his eyes, demonstrable power, but he wants to really emphasize that the true power comes through the performance of mitzvot, right? That's where the real power is, right? There is this other power, but if you really want power, it's with the mitzvot. So I want to go to Joel and Sue first, and then Shirley.
I'll do the sound.
I did.
Okay, hi. We kind of talked about it, and we felt that when you do a mitzvah, you don't do it for rewards. You do it out of the goodness of your heart. And if this is something that they thought of, I know that they probably at that time when the Talmud was written, there was a lot of superstition. But in today's world, we felt that you do a mitzvah for the goodness of it, and you are the one that reap the benefit as well as the person you're giving it to, and that should be enough. Now, whether Rabbi Akiva didn't think that, I don't know, but she didn't know what she was doing when she did it. And he's saying that was her reward, but between you and me, I think it just happened. Okay.
Yes, and you're right. I mean, Sue, there is a very strong tradition that you do a good deed because it's the right thing to do. You don't do a good deed because you're trying to build up enough points to get to heaven, or you're trying to make sure that nothing bad happens to you. Because even if you follow the mitzvot, bad stuff can still happen to you and probably will, right? Doing mitzvot is not going to keep you from getting sick, right? Taking care of yourself, eating well, getting plenty of sleep, going to the doctor, all those things are going to help you, right? But even that's not going to guarantee that you're not going to get sick. But the idea was you should do the mitzvot because that's what you're supposed to do. And so you're absolutely right. And so Rabbi Akiva, and perhaps the reason why it worked is because she did it not to protect herself. She did it because she saw everybody else was busy and nobody was paying attention to this poor guy who needed something to eat. And she saw, and she had food, and she gave the food that was given to her to this person, not expecting that it was going to do anything other than provide food for this person who was hungry and who didn't have any food, right? So yes, it is multifaceted, right? So on the one hand, they're trying to figure out, who's in control of my life? Is it God? Is it me? Is it the constellations? And ultimately here, it's you have agency, right? You have control by living your life in the best possible way, and that's and from Rabbi Akiva's standpoint and the rabbi's standpoint, it's by following the mitzvot, right?
I wanted to say something. What about karma? There's this whole definition of karma. Whatever you you give it and give it, goodness comes back. The other thing is this, she didn't know that she could do this, you know, to kill the snake, but she took that pin. I mean, she was thinking, why, I mean, it had to be in her head someplace that maybe she could save herself.
You know, you know, karma is not necessarily a Jewish.
Right, I know. Yeah,
right?
it's
But
so.
there is a sense that, you know, there's still that sense of, and I guess the closest the Jewish tradition comes to this is when we say midah keneged midah, measure for measure, right? So just as Jacob, and we're reading all about Jacob last week, this week, and next, you know, through the weekly portions, that just as Jacob was a deceiver, so too will he be deceived, right? He took advantage of his brother and his father. He's going to be taken advantage of by Laban, right? And so we wouldn't call it karma. We would say measure for measure. What goes around comes around. That is to say, you are a deceiver, you know, don't be surprised when you get deceived, right? That and so there is that sense, but karma also comes in as a way of helping people understand why do bad things happen to good, right? Why do good things happen to bad people, right? How can somebody continue to lie and cheat and steal and still be successful? And so this idea of karma, you know, well, eventually this person is going to get their comeuppance, right? It may not be today, and it may not be tomorrow, and it may even be in the world to come, right? But it's going to happen. Right? So there's that element of trying to understand what's happening in our world, and so that's a part of it too. Yeah. Jody?
So I kind of read this a little bit differently in that it's struggling with the nature-nurture issue, if we frame it in today's language. And that is, when you look to the sky, you have proof and you have evidence and you have science. So we can believe in that because we can look up and see it. The nurture is the part that we don't see that is communicated either through, at this particular time, through thought and through words and through child rearing, so to speak. But the line becomes blurred when you can't separate it out clearly. And so, yes, we see the stars. Yes, they're in constellations. Yes, they have names and meanings. We get that's really comforting, right? And the fact that she went and offered the food to the person at the door, somewhere along the line, somebody taught her to answer the door and help someone.
Mhm.
That's not written somewhere where you go up to the constellation and go, oh yeah, I'm supposed to feed somebody at the door. So I think that there's this, as you said, it's a thin line. I think if we translate it to today, we think about it in terms of, well, what is genetic? Call that nature, for lack of a better word. And what is nurture, which is what is the environment around us cause us to do.
Yeah. Could you guys on Zoom hear that? Yeah, okay, good. So again, it's using different language. And again, the language that the rabbis have in the Talmud is different than the language we would use today, that there are things that we can attribute to nature, the way things are, and the nurture, the way things, the impact that we have, and the decisions and the choices that we make in this as well, is what Jody was saying. And so, yes, so it's very much of the time that Rabbi Akiva, that this passage in the Talmud is put forward. Okay? Yeah, Ruthie.
comment by Rabbi Schwartz of Temple Sholem years and years ago. And that is that Judaism is a religion of deed and not creed, and that we have agency. And that here was Akiva's daughter who had the agency to recognize a sign that she had to do something. And I think that all of us need to pay attention to certain signs along the road, the path that we take, and we have choices whether to heed that sign or not to heed that sign, and that makes our own mazal. If you want to, is there a word in Hebrew for good luck other than, I mean, mazel tov is congratulations, but it's really good luck, good whatever. I don't know what it is.
No, mazal is luck, it's the signs. It's, it's kind of, may the force be with you kind of a thing. It's just, it's
Yeah.
that sort of a thing. We have other phrases, yashar koach, but that's not really translated as congratulations. That's, more, there's more to it. Kol hakavod is another way of saying, well done. But we don't use those necessarily. We use mazel tov, and it's, and we can see how it works. I mean, at a wedding, what do you say? You say mazel tov, right? Like, you have good luck, may you have good fortune, may you have, see the, anyway, but it has that ancient origin, and so, so it gets embedded in to our language and to how we communicate. But it's, it doesn't necessarily connote what the literal translation means, or we don't necessarily intend it to be as it's literally set out, right? Okay. All right. So let's go to the next text. I want to make sure we have time in looking at this. So the next text is from again, from the Babylonian Talmud, page 54 on the B side of the page, because it's printed as a folio. So there's an A side and a B side. And so the Talmud here goes beyond investigating whether there are competing powers affecting the fate of Jews. In this text, the ancient rabbis describe the world as having its own natural course that God will not interrupt. Okay, and it's interesting, this tractate is called Avodah Zarah, which means strange worship. It's really talking about idolatry, right? Avodah Zarah is idolatry. Okay? So this tractate in the Talmud relates to Jewish engagement with the world at large. It focuses on themes related to politics and religion, with a specific focus on how Jews as monotheists can and should navigate a deeply pagan world. This passage that we're going to look at contains a conversation between a Roman philosopher and some rabbis. It represents a trope throughout rabbinic literature, that of the intellectuals of the pagan community and the intellectuals of the rabbinic community sparring in a Socratic type of dialogue about their respective ideologies, right? Really challenging each other. Based on biblical ideas of divine engagement with the world, one would expect that if God disapproves of something, God would step in to do something about it, and yet that is not the case, right? The questioner assumes that God's inaction will create a deep theological challenge for the rabbis. But they're wrong, right? How can an all-powerful God allow competing gods to persist? Is the bottom line. The rabbinic response is, in the Hebrew, Olam k'minhago noheg. The world follows its natural course, right? This seems very different from biblical theology, right? Rather than asserting that every time God does not approve of something, God will intervene, the rabbis assert that God allows the world to proceed along its natural course. After all, anything else would destroy any semblance of world order. And if you remember, we see this in the Midrash that talks about all the things that get created prior to the creation of the world, right? The talking donkey, Balaam's talking donkey, right? So as not to upset the natural order of the world, because animals don't talk like humans talk. They don't use human language, right? What they say is that this was created before the world was created, right? So it's something literally out of this world that appears at the right time. Same thing with the opening of the earth to swallow up Korach and all of his followers who rebel against Moses and Aaron. This was created before the world was created for this specific purpose at this particular time. So the rabbis, they retroject this and they say all the things that you think are miracles, those were all created beforehand. And you should not think that miracles are happening, in this biblical way, that this is the world goes according to the way the world is supposed to go. Olam kamin hago noheg, right? However, the rabbis do not simply leave this as God's non-intervention, right? Rather, they advocate for a God who chooses not to intervene for the good of the world, but will eventually punish those who behave corruptly, right? You see that line that they're walking here? It's genius. This source that we're going to look at is critical for considering the question of why bad things happen to good people. To what degree does God simply allow the world to proceed the way it naturally does? This is what I want you to consider. And in looking at these texts, two questions that you might consider as you're reading this next text from Avodah Zarah. What do you think of the idea of Olam Kamin Hago Noheg, that the world follows its natural course, as a religious concept? Does it surprise you? Why or why not? And second, what does a relationship with God mean if the world proceeds according to its natural course anyway? Right? I'll say that again. What does a relationship with God mean if the world proceeds according to its natural course anyway? Okay, so take the next few minutes. We're going to take about 7 more minutes to be in Chavruta. I will send you into the breakout groups now. God, I love it when it works.
Consider the case of one who stole about 9 quarts of wheat and went and planted it in the ground. By right, it should not grow. But the world goes along, follows its course, and the fools of sin will be held in judgment in the future in their transgressions.
Consider the case of one who engaged in intercourse with the wife of another. By right, she should not become pregnant. But the world goes along and follows its course, and the fools whose sins will be held to judgment in the future for their transgressions.
We have this chance to change the specific has a choice. The choice has to come first.
But the choice doesn't interfere with the natural order. So, you know, to think that the sun won't come out. You know, something that we can bet on every day is going to be destroyed. It's not a reasonable expectation. Fact is that at some point, people will get the, you know.
Just because it's prohibited sex, doesn't mean it's prohibited.
Yeah. Right.
So we're relying on science, and whatever happens, you know.
If we did not have the covenant. We wouldn't wait for this obligation. We do whatever we wanted to do because it wouldn't matter. This is so mystical.
So then
It's
it's like,
really gets into
I have a relationship with God.
mysticism that we can never talk.
And that's,
Nobody really understands. I don't understand, but it's the mysticism of which is our goal, right? Or the afterlife, which is the first and the whole. Not even think
I
about it.
think the safest path is still the one that follows the law. So I don't, you know, that you want to take a risk and just, you know, who wants the natural order.
Yeah, I think that is easier. Well, I think that it's not me. And the reason is because you're an individual, you're formed to be, so you have to make your own covenant. Rabbi cannot make the covenant for us. If Catholicism, they don't have a covenant. Right? The priest does.
Make will get the pin in the eye also. We're at that.
Yeah, in that story, you know, it says, you know, she did just have a place to put the pins. It was quite rare.
Oh, I think it's the basis of the covenant.
No, I think what they're saying is.
Yes.
Do something wrong.
So what does it say? They will be held to judgment in the future for their transgressions. That saying that God will punish them?
It
The God will
was a
take them.
troubling one because it really is talking about something.
Yeah.
I have to believe.
Judgment. Later could be the next day.
Yeah.
But it goes around, comes around.
That's a mystical to me.
Your first phrase, to me, this implies that our religion.
The idea of consequences.
But the threat of the future getting punished, the threat was, this is a threat.
If you do something wrong, then we'll be
You're gonna get whacked.
imposed by the
I don't know
community.
what people get whacked. Okay. Is that
Concept that I
a
guess
deterrent?
more and more. is pushed down.
That doesn't, it's the relationship with God that is the deterrent. Oh, I think, and such why. Oh, I think it is.
Okay, welcome back. I know there's a lot to unpack here in this text, and before we continue with discussion, I wanted to just bring forward a couple of key ideas that are represented here that you've encountered. Based on biblical ideas of divine engagement with the world, one would expect that if God disapproves of something, God would step in to do something about it, right? Right? The questioner assumes, right? So I went through these. Wait a second. Let me just go through the next. All right, let me stop. Let me open it up to questions. I want to make sure we're sensitive to time here, and tell me what you were thinking about. How did you respond to this olam keminhago noheg? Shaking his head.
Well, they asked first, go ahead.
All right, let me just. Who are you pointing? You're pointing to Shelley? Okay, Shelley, and then Francie.
Yeah. Well, when I read this final paragraph, it's giving really the pro-lifers something really to stand up and sing about.
So I'm not sure that I understood what you said, Shelley.
Especially the last sentence.
Okay, so your internet connection is not coming through well right now.
Well, I'm just saying that if a woman. Okay.
Kelly's saying don't show this to pro-lifers, to folks
Don't
who are
show-
anti-choice.
okay.
That's what she's saying. Keep this out of their hands.
Thank you. Thank you.
What did she say?
It's just that
So, Francie?
if a woman is impregnated, no matter.
It's just a delayed. Yeah.
I won't, Emily, thank you.
Okay. Technology is not our friend in the moment. Francie?
We were wondering if the world is following its natural course, do we find comfort from God or the pain that might come with that? Or is that's not a Jewish phenomenon, perhaps? We were thinking or wondering. Maybe it sounds more Christian somehow.
Yeah, so the challenge, so I don't know if you heard that on Zoom, that what Francie was asking, where's the comfort from God? If the world is going as it's supposed to go, does God bring comfort to us? And thinking that this is not necessarily something that resonates as a Jewish idea, even though it's here in a Jewish text, that we don't necessarily associate it in quite that way if there isn't comfort that's provided, right? So it's a challenge, right? That if the world goes as it's supposed to go, that the comfort that's derived is that the evil will be punished, right? At some point that we may not ever experience, right? That we may not know in witnessing evil of other people, right? And so it's that God is involved, but God doesn't necessarily intervene, right? And so that's that's the tension there, right? That's the tension there. Luann?
So as I've read and reread this paragraph, I saw in this last paragraph, I saw two things that, God is saying, essentially that these transgressors, they're using my creations as if they are not mine, as if they're ownerless.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, and then what I have to go and do, I have to, I have to sign the result of their actions, even though I don't want to. And I think as I'm kind of thinking through that, that's kind of in a little part where that comfort might come in, because it's not just that, somewhere down the road, those who transgressed will get their comeuppance. It's that
this is part of my burden as God as well. And that even though I don't want to do this, I have to do this. And so that's, I guess, where the comfort comes in. He's taking ownership for that.
Yeah, that God is in it with us, right? Just as we're frustrated and feel this is unfair and terrible, that's the way God feels as well in this. Yeah.
So our take on this to begin with, and was brought up rather well, I might add, was that this implies that the relationship that we have with God is our responsibility. That God will do what God will allow to have happen whatever happens based on what we and our actions are. So if we want to have a relationship with God, good, bad, or indifferent, we will be responsible for our actions. And therefore, if you're living life in an improper way, as we have said, one day this may even itself out. But it won't be because God's making it happen that way. It's because we have taken responsibility for our actions.
Right. Yeah, I think so. That yes, it puts the responsibility into our hands. And even more so than in that first text, right? That the world is going to go as it goes, and it's up to you to be involved and to bless you and to set things right, right? Because God's not going to cause the earth to open up and swallow the evildoers, right? That's not going to happen. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Sarah, and then Alana.
Oops, just a second.
Gotcha. Yeah, no.
Got it. Okay. I thought of something that Rabbi Shalman, blessed memory, said in a class I took from him, that when the Holocaust happened, God didn't do anything about it. He said God was off in his space crying. Well, I have to say it didn't make me feel better about the whole thing. And the second point I have to make is that some very religious Jews feel that the Holocaust was punishment for sins, as we may call it, that those Jews or some Jews or whatever did. That doesn't make me feel good. I think that, the fact that the world is made as it was made, people do what they do, and really God does not determine what we do to each other or even to ourselves. And that's the only way I can look at it, is that the world just turns, not because God makes it do that, but because bad things happen to good people.
Right.
Otherwise, I don't know, the faith factor, I don't know how to have faith.
Right. Well, the faith comes in that, that the world is set up with intention, and it does operate the way it's supposed to operate, the way that it was created. And that's the way it's going to keep going. And that the other element of faith is that evil will be punished. And that's what, what the promise is here, or what the theology that's being presented here in Avodah Zarah, is that it's not that people get to just skate, but God is also not going to intervene and cause, whether it's the earth opening up to swallow up the evildoers or a blazing fire to wipe them out. At the same time, it's those terrible things don't happen because so that it's not, a school bus filled with children that gets hit by a train in Petah Tikva It's not because the people in Petah Tikva didn't have kosher mezuzahs on their doorposts, right? That's not the reason. The Holocaust didn't happen because Jews were being bad, right? So here, the Olam Kaminhago Noheg, it means that don't, don't assign those terrible, terrible things to God, that it's because of this bad behavior, right? So again, it's walking a fine line, trying to understand the world around them and trying to understand not only the tragedy of the destruction of the temple and the exile, but what they're seeing in their everyday lives. And that reality.
The cost is very high.
Well, yeah, you can look at it that way. Yeah. Eichmann
was put to death, but look at the cost. I don't know.
Right. That's not the way we're taught to, that's not what this text at least says in terms of measuring things. It's not, that's not for us to do, right? People are going to be true to their nature. The world is going to continue to roll as it's supposed to, as it was designed, right? Jody, did you have?
One of the things that I heard that I find a little bit unsettling is this notion that we're assigning motive to God, either to be the comforter or the punisher, in the sense that whatever attributes there are, the minute we start naming those attributes, we have lessened the concept, the theoretical concept.
Mm-hmm.
And each of us has different definitions of comfort and or punishment. And yet we don't live our lives that way, but we also can't shift the responsibility. Once we go ahead and say, well, God didn't comfort us in this way, we've diminished the concept of God. What we haven't done is gone, how do I comfort myself? Because I have an agreement with an entity, let's call it God, which I can't even define, because if we start defining it by words like comfort and punishment, we've diminished the notion or idea or concept of God. So this is all very mystical to me. We were talking about the fact that it's the individual that makes the covenant with God, but as the world unfolds in front of us, it's quite mysterious.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But we don't blame God for that.
Well, people do blame God for that. That's a part of it. That's the part of the struggle in trying to make sense and trying to, understand God during times of crisis. How do we understand that? How are we in relationship? And so we're moving from the biblical now into the rabbinic in order to understand how has this been addressed, and then how do we address it today, right? That's the piece. So what I want to do is, right, but I want to get to the next text. What was, Phyllis, did you have to say something?
Go ahead.
Okay.
We're not taking responsibility for ourselves.
We're
not blaming God, but we're not blaming us either.
Yeah.
Right, really quickly, I'm not sure what the purpose of God is. That given that I don't mean to be sacrilegious, but given the fact,
listen, we're debating what you said.
Given the fact that we all determine what we do, we experience the natural consequences of that. I'm not sure what the purpose of it is. I don't know. Does anybody?
Right. So hold that question, because I don't think that's a question that we can really address until we have a look at all the texts.
Oh, I like
right.
that.
And so what I want to do is, because we don't have, we have 10 minutes left, a little less than 10 minutes left. I want to look at this text together. We won't go back into Chavruta. So this is a text from Yoma. This text will offer a full-blown theology of Jewish life in exile. God's relationship to the Jewish people is still extant, but God's power lays in self-restraint and in the guarantee of Jewish survival, right? So by way of background, this rabbinic text grapples with the painful experiences of the Jewish people as exiled and persecuted, right? The rabbinic tradition is full of anxiety over the post-temple experience. It questions the very fabric of Jewish ideas of chosenness and a bond with the divine. If God actually chooses the Jewish people, why was their temple destroyed and other empires permitted to rule and persecute them, right? Note that the rabbis themselves, especially those in Babylonia, and those are the rabbis that we're dealing with now, lived in relative peace and security, right? And think of the Jews in America, right? Relative peace and security, right? That's how they were living. Yet the notion of the Roman Empire, characterized by violence, paganism, and corruption, taking over the known world and destroying the temple, challenged them deeply. Okay, so we're going to look at this text, not with enough time, but just to think of these questions. When do you experience cognitive dissonance between your beliefs and what you see in your own life and the world? What do you do to reconcile this dissonance? How does this approach differ from the previous two rabbinic perspectives? And what do you think of the fact that the rabbis have multiple responses to the question of what divine intervention entails? Okay, so here's the text, right? This is from Yoma 69b. Rabbi Joshua, the son of Levi, said, "Why were they called the men of the great assembly? Because they restored the crown to its greatness, i.e., they brought about a renewal of God's greatness." Moses described God as the great, powerful, and awesome God. Jeremiah, who lived and prophesied during the destruction of the first temple, followed and said, "Strangers are frolicking in God's sanctuary. Where are the displays of God's awesomeness?" Therefore, he omitted the term awesome. He removed it from his prayer. Daniel, who lived during the Babylonian captivity that followed the first temple's destruction, followed and said, "Strangers are enslaving God's children. Where are the displays of God's power?" And so he did not say powerful in his prayer. The men of the great assembly followed and said, "On the contrary, this is God's magnificent strength. For God restrains God's will, showing forbearance to the wicked. And these are the displays of God's awesomeness. Because were it not for the awe of the nations, of the blessed Holy One, how could one solitary singular nation survive among the nations of the world? And how could the masters, that is the prophets, do this? Were they not uprooting a tree that Moses made?" Rabbi Elazar said, "They knew that God is truthful, and therefore they would not lie about God." Okay, this is not an easy text. Not that the other two were easy, but this one in particular, right? So in this text, right, the rabbis tried to negotiate their ideology of an all-powerful interventionist God with the reality of the Jewish people, the reality of what they were seeing, what they were experiencing, right? They recognized that there are some, notably the prophets, right, who, when they do not see the hand of God, question God's very sovereignty, right? Where is God? How, God must be very puny if God exists at all. However, the rabbis don't go this route. They don't do the same thing. They do not deny God's power. Instead, they redefine what divine power actually means. First, power can refer to discipline, right? The fact that God holds back from destroying those who persecute the Jews, right? That's God's restraint, God's discipline. And second, power need not mean victory. God can be exerting power by allowing the Jews to survive even if they are not thriving. It's in this way that the rabbis seek to lessen their cognitive dissonance between their beliefs and their reality, right? And so going back to the 20th century horror of the Holocaust, right? It's God's restraint, and what God does make sure happens is that the Jews survived, right? Hitler was not victorious. He did not wipe and annihilate the Jewish people. He destroyed 6 million Jews, 12 million lives. Yeah. And we're still here and we're still thriving. And that is evidence of God's power as well, right? So it's a very different and very challenging perspective, right? Did I see a hand out of the corner of my eye from this table? No, from this table. Phyllis.
This reminds me of the concept of Tzimtzum,
Yeah.
where God withdraws in order to allow for us to exist.
Yes. Yes. So what Phyllis is describing, this idea of Tzimtzum is from Jewish mysticism, and part of the creation story in Jewish mysticism is that God, so the idea is, if God is infinite, there can't be something else, right? There can't be God in the world, right? However, through some process that we don't understand, God withdraws God's self a little bit, enough to leave room for the creation of the world, right? And so this idea of tzimtzum, of pulling back, restraining, disciplining oneself, then gets placed on us as a positive action that we can perform. Making space for others, holding back, being disciplined are all a part of that understanding, right? So here, this is the way the rabbis deal with the dissonance, is that this understanding that God hasn't gone away. God is simply being disciplined. God is simply restraining God's self, and God is making sure that we will continue, right? So that's so that they could live with that because there was evidence of that. Because the Jews weren't destroyed when the temple was destroyed, when the land of Israel was overrun and the Romans came into power. There was an exile, and they're thriving in the exile, right, in Babylon. So how could that possibly be if it weren't for God? That's how that happens. So, so part of their response to that dissonance is understanding and thinking differently about their own experience and the history of how they got to where they were. As Reformed Jews, we've done a similar thing, right? In looking at the destruction of the temple, the temple wasn't destroyed because of our sins. The temple was destroyed in order that we might go out into the world and be a light to the nations. And that's why we call this place Temple Jeremiah and not Congregation Jeremiah, right? We rebuild the temple here. So it's again how we take this on as well, right? It's challenging. It's challenging to be sure, right? Yeah, Jody, and then
When we dwell Vinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, that expresses the dissonance in the role that God plays in our lives. The Father is the nurturer, the comforter, there's a whole bunch of adjectives.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also the King end of it, reflecting upon this removal from us and distancing and being disciplined. And so we appeal to both the Father and the King in that prayer.
Right. So there are prayers that reflect different aspects of the theology, right?
Which is the dissonance.
And so for some it's dissonant. I don't know that I would necessarily use that word with that particular prayer. I think it reveals, it helps us experience, so it helps us think about the different ways that we can experience God. That it's not only as a loving parent, or not only as a protector, ruler God, or just as a creator God, or just as an eternal, steadfast, everlasting rock, but that it's all of the above. But that comes later, right?
Okay.
In this as well. There are two other pieces for further reading. I commend them to you. I will send out the next set of sources. I'm also going to send you a link to a podcast in this next set of readings that I would love for you to have a chance to listen to, I think it's about 30 minutes, the podcast. And let me know if you have any trouble hearing, listening to it. This will be my first time in sending out a podcast, so I want to make sure that the link actually works. Thank you so much. We are going to continue, I believe, next week, right? We have a meeting next Tuesday. Is that true? Yes. No. Right, because we have the Interfaith Thanksgiving service. So that, and then because of Thanksgiving, so let me just make sure. Yes, so the next meeting is on the 30th of November, the 30th of November. That's the Tuesday after Thanksgiving.
I feel like I would have gotten much more out of the reading in the class. And I had those 2 questions that they gave us before the class.
The questions that I shared,
Yeah.
I'm happy to do that.
Your purse is on.
I'm happy to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of the week. Shabbat services continue and Torah study as well. So take care.
Bye.